Okay.
All right. Ready? Long range studies here again. Stephen Follett with Thunderbird Long Range, making and selling the shooting bags.
And Randy Galvin with LRS Precision.
All right. So today the topic is chronographs. Help
Yep.
people decide which chronograph is going to be best for them, understanding a little bit of the pros and cons of each. There's a lot of technical information out there and videos and whatnot, but we figured we'd take about 15 or 20 minutes here and go over the types of chronographs, the purpose for chronographs, and then a kind of compare and contrast uh, qualities and characteristics of the chronograph. So the first thing is why would you get a chronograph? Why is a chronograph an essential component for your reloading gear that you take to the range?
Well, really, it's because if you're going to be shooting long range, you need to have the correct data and correct velocity. I wouldn't even necessarily categorize it as reloading gear. I feel like it's just as important if you're shooting factory ammo versus hand loads.
Very good. So when it comes to that, the ballistic app or even a ballistic table, you need to know what your velocity is because the arc as the bullet leaves your barrel goes up and then it comes down. That's mathematically determined by the velocity of the bullet and the ballistic coefficient.
Yep, absolutely. And without knowing the speed of your bullet, it's a guessing game on where that's going to go.
Yeah. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is for reloading and getting the data on finding a good velocity node, as they say, for your long range ammo. So how do you use a chronograph, or why do you use a chronograph when you're finding when you're doing load development?
Just really, cause especially doing hand loads and stuff, you've got to know what's going to shoot best in your gun, and that's where you're going to be looking at your standard deviations and your ESs or your extreme spreads. Because you can, if you're loading just off of what the book says, some people might be like, it says it's going to go this fast, so I'm going to load exactly this and just do that what the book says instead of doing load development. Then you throw it on the chronograph, and the SDs are crazy, and
Yeah.
it's gonna be affected by your pressure and all that. Whereas very slight changes, 1/10 of a grain of powder here, 2/10 there, depending on the load and stuff. But I mean, we'll get into load development sometime later. But it can go from, I mean, my match load, I've got an SD of about 3 right now. But
Yeah.
when I was working it, I had some loads that were fairly close in the amount of powder I used, where the SDs was in the 20s to 30s.
Yeah. So for shooting long range, just to break that down to its simplest is if you know that it's going 2,900 feet per second every time, then you're better able to predict that. But if the
Yep.
extreme spread, that might be the average, but if your extreme spread is 2915 is the highest, and the other is 2885, then that's an extreme spread of 30. And so if you fire one off and you think you miss high, it might have just been a higher velocity load, and you fire off another one and you miss low, it might just be because of the velocity. And there's some loads that are very consistent. And that's what you're saying with the ES, a low ES and SD. So then you
Right.
know that, hey, I'm not missing high or low because of the amount of powder in there. So not only when we hand load, Randy, we not only look for accuracy, precision, how small the group is, but we also look for where's the velocity, because a higher velocity, you're going to shoot, the bullet will shoot higher and lower. So why a chronograph? It's to get your dope for your bullet, which you absolutely need, whether you're doing hand loads or factory ammo. But the other part of it is if you're doing hand loads, then you can get to a quality load that you know will shoot well at long range without very much variation
Yep.
difference in the velocity. And I know that there's one other way that it's useful if you're at the range shooting and you're tracking the velocity real time, right? So you're able to watch, and if you miss high, you can look at the velocity and you can say, oh, wow, that was a hot load. That's why I missed high. Or I missed low, the load was low. So that's one thing. And now I think you see at the ELR matches where velocity is super important. If they miss low, they want to know whether the velocity was slow, because making changes in elevation, they don't want to be chasing the load around. So I think you'll see them with using magneto speeds or lab radars as they're shooting in the competitions for that purpose. So chronographs are a specific tool so that you can put quality information into your data, into your apps, because garbage in, garbage out. You want the cleanest and best, and that's why you want a chronograph.
Right, and you're starting to see that in this PRS matches too. Last couple I've been to on prone stages, people are attaching magneto speeds to their guns.
Yeah. Interesting. I haven't seen that at the PRS ones. That seems a little bit over the top. I don't know whether I'd ever get to that point, but
yeah, it's helped a couple of guys I know. So it's definitely
it's definitely helpful. Like I said, I don't know whether I could see myself doing it right away or not. But Randy, so explain the 3 types of chronographs that people can find out there.
Okay, yeah. So the 3 basic types are going to be your optical chronograph. You've got your magnetospeed chronographs, and then you've got Doppler radar, or typically lab radar is what's the consumer grade radar. Optical, that's your old.
So describe what the optical chronograph looks like. I think everybody was probably familiar with.
Yeah, everyone's probably seen it. You've got your box with a couple pillars coming up, and then 2 screens over the top of it. And basically what those are doing, they're casting a shadow over the optical sensors, and they'll count between the time the bullet where it makes a shadow over one sensor and the time it takes for the bullet to travel to the next sensor. And that's what's used to give you your speed. They've been using those. That was really the standard up until fairly recently, when magnetospeed started coming out with their stuff, is when you started seeing more people getting away from the optical stuff.
Yeah, and you can use the optical, and certainly the higher quality ones are going to be accurate, and they're some of the finest ones that have been used for a long time, right? People shot with them and used them for a long time.
Oh yeah, I think that
what are the
technology is probably 50, 60 years old now.
Yeah.
Or
I think
somewhere in there.
One of the first ones to really pioneer it.
Yeah, it's been out a long time.
Makes it, but I don't know the history. I haven't been shooting that long, and I haven't really had to think about it. But that was actually, because that was the common knowledge just for shooters. I went and bought an RCBS optical chronograph and used it several times. And
yeah, my first one was a Caldwell.
Yeah, and it was helpful. Those are some of the least expensive ones. But
yeah, you're looking at between $60 and $80 for the optical ones.
The cheapest ones, yeah.
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 And then they go way up. Like I mean, they do have some that are $300-$400.
So they have their limitations because they're requiring light.
Yes.
And so if you have a cloudy day, what does clouds do to the chronograph's ability to read that shadow?
Exactly. And that was my biggest frustration when I had the Caldwell years ago, was I might be shooting, it might be a nice sunny day, getting everything fine, then a cloud goes over and you lose the ability to track the bullets and you get all kinds of errors. And it would just get really frustrating because it was stuff you had no control over. If there was rain, you can't use it. There's all kinds of limitations with it.
Not surprisingly, I didn't have the cloud cover problem in Arizona. It was really never too dark. Yeah. I could always get a reading. But my problem what I didn't like about was I had to set it up. And so if I was prone, I had to set it up because I had to shoot over the sensors, but below the screen. So I had the little triangle, and then you have to put your muzzle to the first screen so that they can do that. Because then you had to subtract kind of back into the actual speed at the muzzle, right?
Right. And it's like, I've never done it, but I've seen a lot of people, since you're shooting through a fairly small window. I mean, it's what, about like that, give or take. It's been a while since I've used one, but you've got to shoot through that. Typically, people are putting them 5-10 yards out, and I've seen quite a few of them get shot.
Yeah.
Either the screens will get shot. That's the more typical thing I've seen. A lot more of the screens or the posts that hold the screen up get shot. But I've also seen people put a bullet straight through the middle of it because they didn't
Sure.
either their scope wasn't adjusted right or they just weren't paying attention or whatever.
Yeah, not paying attention, or they're shooting on a different part of the target, or whatever the case
Yep.
might be. But and it's pretty big, and the wind affects it. So if the wind is blowing it, there's just lots of issues. It's much more sensitive, and you're going to be limited as to when and how you use the optical.
Exactly.
Uh, but let's. But if you have a limited amount of money, then you can get the cheapest optical and you can use it. Just understand that you're going to have those limitations. They're not quite as sensitive. Look at the sensitivity so that you'll understand that. So you won't be able to get the same look and the same refinement, the level of measurement that you will from a magnetospeed or a lab radar. So those are the other two kinds. So how does a magnetospeed generally work if you were to explain it, right?
Yeah, so the magnetospeed attaches to your originally designed. They attach to your barrel. They've got a lot of companies now that, and magnetospeed makes one as well, an adapter that'll attach to like a rail system on your gun, so it doesn't hang off the barrel anymore because that was an issue people had. But it's basically a bayonet-looking device that is right under the muzzle of your gun, and it uses the magnetic field to detect the bullet traveling over it.
Yeah. So with the magnetospeed, you need to make sure that the rail is lined up directly beneath the bore. What's that measurement? Is it a quarter of an inch?
I think so. On the V3, they've got a rod that you use to measure with it, so it's got a device
So you
to.
can put a rod into your bore and measure it, but you just need to get that lined up. Once you get it lined up, then you're good to go.
Yep.
Typically, my experience, I had a magnetospeed, and I just needed to figure out the sensitivity. I think it's almost for that magnetospeed, not really necessarily rifle based. Maybe it is, but I found once I adjusted it for one rifle that it worked for any of my center fire rifles. I never ran it on like a 22, so I wouldn't know that.
That was the same thing I found with the V3 that I have. So once that's set, it's set. I've never had to mess with it since.
Yeah.
Then.
And so the sporter, it will work on sporter barrels up to heavy varmint barrels, because the bayonet is a shorter sweep, and then it has a little computer and it gives you one line at a time. So you have to click a lot to get to see all of the data and everything come across. But the magnetospeed, I think, what was it? We see $180. Is that about?
For the magnetospeed sporters, 180. The one I've got is the V3, which gives you a little bit more options for suppressors, bigger guns, and you've got more data on the readout than on the sporter.
So
if 5 line. I think it's your last 5 shots, plus it shows your SD and ES.
Yeah. So if you've seen the picture where it said, "Hey, look at this great ES," and it's a little readout screen. It's got 3 lines on this side and 3 lines on this side, right? So 3 but yeah, so that's the magnetospeed V3 that you're talking about there, right?
Yep, and that's honestly probably becoming the standard for most competition shooters at this point.
Yeah. I think you're right on that. And the other version is the lab radar. And both of us have the lab radar and use the lab radar. So that's the big orange box that you set up and you point towards the target, and you set the input for the bullets and the offset and things like that. And then the muzzle blast actually has triggers the magnetospeed the lab radar to send out the radar. It'll track the bullet and it'll give you muzzle velocity, and you can even program it to give you different velocities at different distances. And of course, it saves a series of shots, and it'll give you the ES and SD, and it also gives you velocity and energy and some other calculations as well.
Yeah, and it's pretty nice too, especially since they came out with the Bluetooth app for it that lets you control it and see everything on a phone or tablet.
Yeah, that's super nice, because you don't have to reach over to arm it. You can arm it and see it on your phone.
And depending on what type of shooting you do too, if you do anything with pistol competition or just pistols in general, archery stuff like that, you can also use the lab radar for that. I know I don't personally shoot pistol competition, but I know for like IDPA and IPSC stuff, you can get your power factor from the lab radar, and it does a few other things with that, and it lets you get some stuff for archery as well.
Yeah. If you do like archery or I think air guns or rimfire, it has a separate trigger.
Yeah, that's
Archery,
also
a physical trigger, and then there's for the other ones there's a separate microphone if you run a suppressor. I run suppressor, and I've run the suppressor right next to my buddy with a 300 Win Mag with a brake, right? A brutal brake that just pounds me with muzzle blast, and I can be shooting with my suppressor, and his rifle doesn't set it off next to me. The only problem I've ever had, if it wasn't user error, was there was another guy using the lab radar the first time that it ever happened, and we were set on the same frequency, and so we were just tripping each other. Neither one of us could get a reading, and then I'm like, oh hey, you've got a lab radar, that's why it's doing it. And so he changed it to a new frequency, and we were running it right next to each other, and it was good to go. So most of the problems that you see with the magneto speed or the lab radar not tracking, it's either user error in setup or a setting, a sensitivity setting. Because the magneto speed, it was right on once I figured out how to use it, and then the lab radar, the same way there.
yeah, same thing. With the lab radar, you have to aim it at the target. I have read about people having issues with getting it, being able to pick up the target even when they aim it. I've never personally seen that issue. I don't believe you've seen that issue either, Stephen. So there's
Yeah,
that.
I have had issues shooting in the desert where there might be a bush. So there was like, I think that the lab radar, it would just, when it sent out the radar, like having stuff in the vicinity close between me and the target, it wasn't directly between it, but it was close enough that it was goofing it up. But I took that bush out and haven't had problems there since.
Yeah,
But so we've talked a little bit about if you need a chrono and you just want to get one and you understand the limitations and you only have a limited amount of money and you want to do it, then you can go with the optical, right? But that's really the only situation that either of us I think are going to recommend it.
yeah,
But
and really,
oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, and really, even with funds limited, if you can save up an extra $100, you can get the Magneto Speed Sporter versus an optical. So
Yeah, I had the optical and I gave it away to a friend and just bought the Magneto Speed Sporter. I used that, and then once I figured out how I was going to shoot and how much and the setup to be able to shoot from gun to gun and help friends with guns and just not have to mess with the bayonet, lab radar just made the most sense for me. So if it's just a guy and you typically go out shooting and you want to get your dope and you set it up for one or two rifles, what are you going to recommend, Randy, for someone that's going to look for a chronograph to do long range shooting?
for someone, especially someone getting into long range shooting, I'm definitely going to recommend the Magneto Speed. Unless you, like I talked about with the lab radar, unless you're doing a bunch of pistol competition stuff where it would be useful for that, or if you're shooting a lot of different guns.
Yeah, the multiple uses. There's more flexibility moving between with the lab radar.
There is,
One thing between the Magneto Speed and the lab radar, the Magneto Speed is like this big, and the lab radar is like this big, right? So my Pelican case is a big case. So lots of people like the V3 simply because or the Magneto Sporter because they can just throw it in their backpack with everything else. But I have to have a separate case for the lab radar. So if you want small form factor, definitely the V3 or the Sporter.
Yeah, and then you've also got to factor cost into it as well, because I know we talked about the optical chronos are anywhere from, they start at $59 to $79, and then they go all the way up to $400 or $500, I believe, for the really expensive ones. I'm not that familiar with those. But then your MagnetoSpeed Sporters, 180. Your V3, the MSRP on it is 380. And I think that's probably the best value for what you get,
Yeah.
because it'll pretty much work on any gun, and it gives you more user-friendly settings to look at the results. And then
So
the
this
lab,
is, oh, go ahead.
oh, sorry.
Yeah, cost on
And the lab radar is 560 is the MSRP on there, 559.
Yeah.
So that bumps up the price a good bit. So unless you need those features, I don't know if it's worth the extra $200.
Yeah. So this is where I'm at on the value. I still like the MagnetoSpeed, I think. For most people, just ease of operation, setup, and everything else is one. You can't use the MagnetoSpeed Sporter if you run suppressed. So if you run suppressed, you got to get the V3 or the lab radar, right? So you have to get one of those two.
Yep.
Now, and if you do run suppressed, or you want to do something and you want to use the MagnetoSpeed Sporter MagnetoSpeed V3, when it comes to cost, if you buy one of the really nice bayonet attachments that take it off the barrel so that you don't mess with harmonics or whatever, then you got to add to the cost of that. So if you're what, 389 for the V3?
380 even.
380. Okay, so 380 for the V3. Some of those bayonet kits can run that almost as much to the lab radar. So look at the total cost of what you're doing. I run my lab radar on top of a tripod and shoot next to the side. But there's different ways that you can do it. Just be aware that the lab radar, it's like a big sail. And so a lot of people, if it blows over, it's not going to be as robust as the little V3 computer or Sporter computer and the bayonet, right? You put a little piece of that. I've seen people put like a little blast shield on the bayonet. You know, the MagnetoSpeed is not going to be broken as easy as, and I'm saying relatively, right? The lab radar, if it blows over, continued muzzle blast, you know, on the, I've heard people say, I've shot with mine a lot, and I shoot suppressed so it doesn't get as much muzzle blast as a lot of them. But those are one of the things to think of is look at total cost, look at the total package. But if it comes down to money, then you kind of get pretty close to get the V3 and the lab radar set up so that you don't have a point of impact change with either one. You can get a point of impact change with the MagnetoSpeed attached to your barrel.
Yeah.
That's why if you shoot it off of the barrel or whatever. But that's one. So.
Yeah, that's really the only downside to the MagnetoSpeed is if you're attaching it to the barrel. But it's not going to affect your group size. It's just going to really affect your point of impact. Okay. And it depends on the gun. From what I've seen from using it and talking to other people that have it, the heavier barrels are not affected nearly as much as if you put on like a hunting rifle or something with your point of impact.
Absolutely. It's the stiffness of the barrel. So if it's a stiff barrel, so a short, round bull varmint barrel is not going to whip around, and so you're going to have very little, if no, point of impact. But if it's longer, you know, carbon fiber, you're going to get a little bit more whip, a little bit more point of impact. It can change group size a little bit based upon that, but group size usually doesn't change. Point of impact can move.
Yeah.
But if that's what you want, then either get a lab radar or get the adapter so that you don't have to attach it to your rifle.
Yep.
I also wanted to point out, we didn't cover it, but on the MagnetoSpeed, they have the cable that you can download the data. XFR cable, I think is what they're calling it. I can't remember for sure.
It's basically an auxiliary cable.
It is. I'm not sure if it's a specialized one or what.
I don't believe it is. I think you can use any auxiliary cable for it.
Well, if that's the
don't
case,
don't quote me 100% on that, but I'm like 90% sure that any auxiliary cable will work with a MagnetoSpeed.
Yeah, I don't know. I bought the cable and it was awesome. I'd finish shooting and then I would download it, and then I could look at everything on my phone instead of having to click through on the Sporter. So if you get the Sporter, just know that once you're finished shooting, you can then look at all the data on your phone, which is super easy to do. Let me look at here's some of my notes, some of the things that we covered. Yeah, I think we've pretty much covered all of the points with the magneto speed and the lab radar as far as which to choose.
Yeah,
Again, figure out how you're going to shoot it, and then you'll be able to know which one you want. I would go with either one, V3 or the lab radar, but because I tend to go shoot and I'm inviting buddies, yeah, come out, let me collect the data for your rifle. I just find it easier to have them sit down next to me on the bench, move the tripod, adjust the bullet weight, and shoot. Whereas the magneto speed, having to attach it to their barrel and do those things, that I personally found that more annoying. Some people don't like that, and they don't like having to aim the lab radar. So it's a personal choice, but both are going to get you right in there. Both of us have ran the magneto speed on our rifle and shot with the lab radar. So what was your experience in looking at the velocities? How precise were they in measuring the velocity of the bullet?
Oh, I've never seen them more than 2 to 3 feet per second different between the two.
I wanted to test. I'm like, I'm going to do a big test, and I shot like 50 one day, and that was my experience. And so after that point, I'm like, I'm not even going to test it because I know they're both the same.
Yeah, and everything I've read online and done research on them has shown everyone's getting about the same results with that. So you're going to be within 2-3 feet.
Yeah, I didn't count it, but this is my feeling on it. Probably 50%, 40 to 50% were the exact same velocity. About, maybe another 30% were between 1 and 2 feet per second different. And maybe 5 to 10% would be 3 feet per second difference. So really, you're talking, for all intents and purposes, perfectly identical. And it was never one more than the other, as far as it wasn't lab radar was always high or low or anything like that. I will say that I think you've gotten it a couple of times, and I've talked with some other people. Sometimes with a lab radar, you just get a wild reading, and I don't know what it is. I think you've said you've got one at like 14,000 feet per second.
I've had that happen once. The range was busy. I'm pretty sure someone fired their rifle that went through my radar path at right about the same time I fired mine, within like milliseconds of each other, and it just picked up my muzzle, leaving my muzzle, and then picked up theirs at the end.
I think you're guessing at that, honestly, simply because of the offset and everything else. I've talked with because I got one like that. I'm like, oh, that is not right. And so I talked with some people, and there were guys that shoot them all the time and shoot them at the range and use it every day, and it's hundreds and thousands of rounds, far more than I do. And they said that just sometimes they would get an off reading, but you would know it was off. It wasn't like a little bit off or anything.
Yeah.
But you'd get it off. I can't remember the specifics on when they thought it would happen, but it's a very strange anomaly. It's rare. I think it's happened once, maybe twice, that I got a reading. I'm like, that's not right. And as far as sensitivity, I will say that I ran it with a suppressor, so it's on a higher sensitivity, shooting it at a full range with people shooting all around me. I've shot it with my buddy, shooting a 300 Win Mag and a 6.5 Creedmoor, 300 RUM. On the bench next to me, they're shooting it, their rifles, and it does not trigger mine. It has to be, with the setting and knowing how to set it up, I have never had anybody trigger my lab radar. Never.
No, I haven't. Yeah, I've never had that happen.
Yeah, so
and like the anomaly, I've only ever seen it do that once. And like you said, it's something because you're shooting a group. I was shooting like 5-round groups with a 6.5 Creedmoor and got my pretty good standard deviation, good velocities and everything. And then one of the rounds was like 14,000 feet per second.
Yeah, it's like super high. It's like some weird glitch or whatever, but that's there. And I'd say we've been doing these podcasts, and I'm ready to wrap it up here. I don't think I've got anything else to add. But if anybody had any questions, Randy, you and I are on Facebook, especially you can ping the page Long Range Studies.
Yep.
We're there. Also, Long Range Shooters, the Facebook group Long Range Shooters. Randy, you started that one up and was gracious enough to let me in as a moderator and now admin. But shoot us a message, ping the page. PM the page, whatever. If you have any specific questions, things that we haven't covered, things that would help you understand, hey, what about this? And we'll kind of give you our opinion. We like both of them, frankly. But personally, I just run the Lab Radar, and I think you run both of them depending upon the day, what you're going to do, right?
I mean, for me, I run the Lab Radar more often, but for someone getting into shooting, I'll recommend that they go with the magneto speed. It's just, I think that's better for most people.
That's my recommendation. If you're just a guy and you need it for you, and you're just a loner, you know, and you're not putting on a lot of guns, doing a lot of different things or whatever, then I think the magneto speed is the best option for you. And either one will do good. Just personal preference. How would you see it? But I know I talk to lots of guys. They're like, what is that orange thing at the range? And I'll explain it and talk with them. So if you see somebody with a magneto speed or a Lab Radar, just ask them their impressions, what they like and what they don't like, and you'll figure it out pretty good. Well, that's all from me. Anything else final from you, Randy?
Nope, that's everything I've got. So.
All right. Well, that wraps up this episode on chronographs for long range studies. We'll talk to you again soon.
Yep, have a good night.